Chapter 1: A Taxonomy of the Uninvited. If you listen to enough UFO stories, a strange thing happens. The details begin to repeat. Not the circumstances, not the witnesses, not the conclusions, but the beings themselves. The same shapes return. The same eyes. The same hierarchies. The same roles. Over decades, across continents, through belief systems that do not agree on anything else, the cast remains remarkably stable. This episode is not about proving that aliens exist. It is about acknowledging that human encounters with the unknown have produced a consistent internal structure. A taxonomy. Categories that were not imposed all at once, but emerged slowly, through accumulation, argument, and reluctant agreement. People did not start by saying, "There are types." They started by saying, "This is what I saw." And then someone else, far away, said the same thing. Taxonomy is what we do when we cannot explain something but need to manage it anyway. We classify storms, diseases, animals, and stars long before we understand how they work. Naming is not understanding. Naming is containment. Once something has a category, it feels less chaotic, less personal, less dangerous. The history of alien classification follows the same pattern. Early UFO encounters focused on craft. Lights in the sky. Objects that moved incorrectly. When beings entered the reports, they were often described as nearly human. The strangeness was subtle. Height. Clothing. Silence. Over time, the entities became less familiar. Heads grew larger. Eyes grew darker. Bodies thinned. Authority structures emerged. Supervisors. Workers. Observers. The encounters shifted from meetings to examinations. What changed was not just belief. It was behavior. The phenomenon adapted to attention, to culture, to expectation, while retaining a core set of forms that refused to disappear. Greys did not replace earlier humanoids by accident. Reptilians did not emerge randomly. Mantids did not appear in isolation. Each type occupies a niche within a larger ecosystem of reports. This raises an uncomfortable question. Are these beings distinct species, as described? Or are they roles within an experience that reshapes itself depending on context? Taxonomy can hide as much as it reveals. By dividing encounters into types, we may be mistaking a single complex phenomenon for many separate ones. Throughout this series, we will look at alien types as they are described, not as they are explained. We will examine where they are said to come from, how they behave, and why they appear when they do. We will talk about claimed homeworlds and star systems, but we will also talk about patterns of control, observation, and hierarchy. We will treat contactee stories and abduction narratives with equal seriousness, without assuming they describe the same event or even the same reality. This is not a field guide in the comforting sense. It will not tell you what to expect or how to protect yourself. It will show you how classification becomes a coping mechanism when experience overwhelms explanation. When witnesses cannot agree on meaning, they agree on shape. When purpose is unclear, they agree on form. The first 9 types we will explore are not the strangest, but the most foundational. They are the figures that anchor the rest. Remove them, and the entire structure collapses. They appear again and again because they solve a narrative problem. They give witnesses something to point to. They give investigators something to argue over. They give the unknown a face. But faces can lie. Categories can mislead. And once a taxonomy exists, it begins to shape what is seen next. Future witnesses unconsciously fill in gaps. Skeptics dismiss consistency as contamination. Believers see confirmation everywhere. The phenomenon continues, indifferent to the arguments it generates. The question we will not answer is whether these beings are real in the way we understand reality. The question we will keep returning to is why these specific forms persist, why they are so difficult to dislodge, and why attempts to replace them with simpler explanations never quite work. This is not a story about visitors arriving from the stars. It is a story about intrusion, classification, and the human need to organize fear into something that can be spoken aloud. Because once you name what is watching you, you can at least pretend you understand it. Welcome to Strange, where today we'll be delivering the first part of our look at the taxonomy of Earth-visiting aliens. Chapter 2: The Greys. The Greys are not the first aliens to appear in human stories, but they are the ones that stayed. Before them came figures that looked almost human, visitors who could pass in a crowd if you did not stare too long. The Greys ended that ambiguity. They are immediately wrong. Their bodies announce otherness before they move, before they speak, before they act. Descriptions are strikingly consistent. Short in stature, usually between 3 and 4 feet tall. Thin limbs with joints that appear fragile but function with precision. Large heads tapering to narrow chins. Skin described as grey, ash-colored, or pale beige, with a texture that witnesses struggle to compare to anything familiar. The eyes dominate every account. Oversized, black, almond-shaped, reflective, and unreadable. There is rarely mention of pupils. Rarely mention of blinking. Witnesses do not describe being looked at. They describe being examined. The Greys are most closely associated with abduction narratives. Unlike earlier contactee encounters, which often involved conversation and warnings, Grey encounters are procedural. People are taken. They are immobilized. They are moved through spaces that feel clinical rather than exploratory. Tables appear. Instruments are present. The environment resembles a laboratory more than a spacecraft. Communication, when it occurs, is usually reported as telepathic. The messages are minimal and functional. Do not be afraid. This will not take long. You will forget. These statements are not comforting. They are directives. The Greys do not negotiate. They inform. Claims about their origin vary, but the most frequently cited home system is Zeta Reticuli, a binary star system roughly 39 light-years from Earth. This association entered UFO lore largely through the account of Betty and Barney Hill, whose 1961 abduction experience introduced many elements that would become standard. Star maps. Medical examination. Memory disruption. Whether the Zeta Reticuli origin is literal, symbolic, or retroactively imposed remains unresolved, but it persists with unusual resilience. Famed sightings and encounters involving Greys span decades and continents. The Hill abduction. The Pascagoula incident. The Travis Walton case. Later mass experiences described in regression therapy sessions during the 1980s and 1990s. Critics argue that hypnosis contaminated these narratives. Supporters argue that hypnosis revealed what fear suppressed. What matters for taxonomy is not which side is correct, but that the same beings appear regardless of methodology. The Greys are rarely described as individuals. They function as units. When multiple are present, they move with coordination but little apparent hierarchy. They are task-oriented. Efficient. Emotionless in the human sense. Witnesses often report a disturbing sense that the Greys are not curious about them as people. They are interested in bodies, nervous systems, reproductive capacity, and perception. This has led to the theory that Greys are not explorers but technicians. Workers rather than leaders. The consistency of their behavior supports this idea. They do not linger. They do not explain. They do not seem surprised by resistance or distress. Everything about them suggests repetition. They have done this before. Many times. One of the most unsettling aspects of Grey encounters is the sense of enforced calm. Witnesses describe terror paired with an imposed emotional suppression, as if fear itself were being managed externally. This effect reinforces the impression of control. Not only of the body, but of experience itself. Skeptics often argue that the Greys are a cultural artifact, a modern myth shaped by science fiction imagery. But this explanation struggles to account for the depth of consistency across cases that predate popular depictions. Once the Greys enter the cultural bloodstream, they do not mutate wildly. They stabilize. That stability is unusual for a fictional archetype. The Greys occupy the foundation of modern alien taxonomy because they define the shift from encounter to intervention. They are not visitors waving from craft. They are operators entering bedrooms. They do not ask to be believed. They act as if belief is irrelevant. Whether they are extraterrestrial, interdimensional, artificial, or psychological projections, the Greys establish a tone that all other alien types inherit. Contact is not mutual. Observation is not passive. The universe, in these stories, does not come to meet us. It comes to use us. And it does so without apology. Chapter 3: The Tall Greys. The Tall Greys rarely arrive alone. In witness testimony, their presence is often remembered as a shift rather than an event. Something changes in the room before they are seen. The smaller Greys pause. Movement slows. The encounter reorganizes itself. Physically, tall Greys resemble an exaggerated version of the standard Grey form. Witnesses describe them as 6 to 8 feet tall, thin to the point of appearing fragile, yet balanced in a way that suggests strength without muscle. Their heads are elongated, their skin pale grey or chalk white, and their eyes dominate every description. Unlike smaller Greys, tall Greys are often described as having defined mouths and subtle facial structure, though witnesses rarely remember them speaking aloud. One of the earliest detailed accounts involving tall Greys appears in long-term abduction narratives from the 1970s and 1980s, particularly among witnesses who reported repeated contact over years. In these cases, tall Greys are described as entering the room after initial paralysis has already occurred. The smaller entities begin examinations, and then stop. The tall Grey arrives. Oversight replaces action. In the Whitley-Strieber case, often cited but still deeply contested, tall Greys appear as commanding figures within the broader abduction experience. Strieber described entities that stood apart from the others, communicating directly and asserting control without force. Whether one accepts his interpretation or not, the structure of the encounter mirrors dozens of others. The tall Grey does not need to restrain. Its presence is sufficient. In a lesser-known case from upstate New York in the late 1980s, a woman reported repeated nocturnal abductions involving multiple small Greys performing examinations. During one encounter, she described a tall Grey standing near the doorway of the examination room, observing silently. When she attempted to move or scream, the tall Grey reportedly turned its head toward her, at which point her panic abruptly flattened into emotional neutrality. She later described the sensation as being turned down, not calmed, but reduced. This emotional suppression is a recurring feature. Witnesses describe fear that spikes and then vanishes unnaturally. The tall Grey is frequently identified as the source of this control. Smaller Greys perform physical actions. Tall Greys manage perception. In some encounters, tall Greys communicate telepathically in a manner witnesses describe as invasive rather than conversational. Messages are delivered as completed thoughts rather than sentences. There is no room for response. Common statements include assurances that the process is necessary, that the witness has agreed previously, or that resistance is irrelevant. These messages often feel rehearsed, as if delivered many times before. Claims about the origin of tall Greys are inconsistent but persistent. Some witnesses report being shown star systems or environments distinct from those associated with smaller Greys. Others are told nothing at all. In more elaborate narratives, tall Greys are positioned as intermediaries between humanity and a larger, unseen intelligence. They are not decision-makers, but enforcers. In the Hopkins and Jacobs abduction research material, tall Greys frequently appear in cases involving hybrid beings. They are described as overseeing interactions between human abductees and entities identified as part human. In these accounts, tall Greys provide instruction, correction, and approval. The tone is procedural. Emotional response from witnesses is noted but not addressed. One particularly unsettling pattern involves tall Greys appearing at moments of resistance. Witnesses who attempt to fight, flee, or mentally block the experience often report the sudden appearance of a taller entity, followed by deeper paralysis and loss of time. The encounter ends shortly afterward. The message is clear. Escalation triggers oversight. Skeptical interpretations suggest that tall greys represent authority figures within the human psyche, manifested during stress or trauma. But this explanation does not account for the consistency of their role across independent cases. The tall grey is not just larger. It is different. It behaves differently. It appears when control is threatened. In the taxonomy of alien encounters, tall greys mark the moment when randomness gives way to structure. They imply hierarchy. They suggest planning. They transform abduction from an anomaly into a managed operation. If the smaller greys feel like tools, the tall greys feel like policy. And policy, once enforced, does not ask whether you believe in it. Chapter 4: The Nordics. The Nordics are the most unsettling alien type for a simple reason. They look like us. Not almost human in the abstract sense, but specifically human in a way that feels intentional. Witnesses do not struggle to describe them. They struggle to explain why they were not mistaken for ordinary people. Nordics are typically described as tall, well-proportioned humanoids with light skin, light hair, and light-colored eyes. Their features are symmetrical, calm, and unmistakably human. They wear clothing rather than appearing unclothed or uniformed, often described as simple jumpsuits or fitted garments without markings. Unlike greys, they do not appear fragile or clinical. They appear composed. The earliest prominent Nordic encounters appear in the contactee era of the 1950s and early 1960s. George Adamski's accounts are the most famous and the most controversial. Adamski claimed repeated contact with tall, blonde humanoids who spoke calmly about humanity's future, nuclear danger, and spiritual development. Skeptics dismissed these stories as fantasy, but Adamski's descriptions established a template that would recur independently. Nordics are most often associated with direct communication. Witnesses report spoken language, telepathic exchange, or a combination of both. The tone of these communications is markedly different from grey encounters. Nordics explain. They warn. They instruct. They rarely examine. Their interest appears ideological rather than biological. Claims about Nordic origins vary widely, but the most frequently cited source is the Pleiades star cluster. Witnesses report being shown images of worlds described as peaceful, technologically advanced, and environmentally harmonious. These visions are often accompanied by moral framing. Humanity is presented as immature, violent, or reckless. The Nordics position themselves as observers who have already survived these phases. In the famous 1967 encounter of Howard Menger, Nordics were described as living among humans, indistinguishable unless revealed. Menger claimed lifelong contact with beings who appeared entirely human, blending into society without effort. Whether true or not, this narrative introduced a deeply destabilizing idea. The visitors are not arriving. They are already here. Nordic encounters often lack the fear that dominates grey abductions. Witnesses report calm, reassurance, and a sense of purpose. But this calm has an edge. The Nordics are not equals. They do not ask for permission. They speak from a position of authority, even when presenting themselves as benevolent. This dynamic becomes more troubling in later reports, where Nordics appear alongside greys. In these accounts, Nordics are sometimes described as supervisors or intermediaries, presenting a friendly face for a process that remains invasive. The comforting exterior masks a system that continues to extract, observe, and interfere. Unlike greys, Nordics are often described as emotionally expressive. They smile. They make eye contact. They acknowledge fear. This makes them harder to dismiss as mechanical or artificial. It also makes them harder to trust. A being that looks human and claims moral superiority occupies a dangerous psychological position. Skeptics argue that Nordic aliens reflect post-war cultural anxieties, idealized human forms projected into space. There is truth in this critique. The Nordics align uncomfortably with mid-century ideals of beauty and order. But cultural projection alone does not explain their persistence across decades, or their appearance in cases far removed from the original contactee movement. One recurring element in Nordic encounters is the promise of guidance without accountability. They warn of catastrophe but rarely intervene directly. They claim concern while maintaining distance. Humanity is told it must choose its own path, even as that path is observed and influenced. In the broader taxonomy, Nordics represent a bridge between the familiar and the alien. They soften the shock of contact while reinforcing hierarchy. They suggest that the universe contains beings who look like us, think like us, and still consider us inferior. If the Greys teach intrusion and the tall Greys teach control, the Nordics teach something subtler and perhaps more dangerous. They teach compliance through reassurance. They do not take you by force. They convince you that listening is your idea. Chapter 5. The Mantids. Mantid beings tend to enter the record sideways. They are rarely the first thing a witness remembers, and almost never the first thing a witness wants to talk about. In many accounts, they appear only after years of recalled contact, emerging late in regression sessions or long after the witness has accepted the presence of Greys. This delay is important. Mantids do not introduce the experience. They reveal its structure. Mantids are described with unsettling consistency. Tall, usually 7 to 9 feet. Narrow, segmented torsos with an insect-like precision that feels engineered rather than biological. Long arms that bend backward at the joints. Hands with elongated fingers, sometimes described as clawed but more often described as delicate, capable of fine control. The head is triangular, dominated by large, multifaceted eyes that do not blink and do not emote. Color varies, but green, brown, and black recur most often. Witnesses rarely describe clothing. Mantids appear complete as they are. Unlike Greys, Mantids are almost never described as touching human bodies. Their power is not physical. It is cognitive. Witnesses consistently report that Mantids communicate telepathically in a way that bypasses language entirely. Thoughts are not sent. They are pulled. Memories surface fully formed, without narrative. Emotional states are accessed and adjusted with precision. In long-term abduction cases documented by researchers such as Bud Hopkins and David Jacobs, Mantids frequently appear during what witnesses describe as instruction phases. These are moments when abductees are shown procedures, environments, or other beings. In several cases, Mantids are described as explaining processes involving hybrid entities, human reproductive material, or future scenarios. The explanations are not philosophical. They are technical. One frequently cited case from the American Midwest in the early 1990s involved a woman who reported repeated abductions beginning in childhood. For decades, she recalled only Greys. During a later regression session, she described a sudden realization that a much larger being had always been present, standing behind the Greys, partially obscured. When asked why she had not noticed it before, she reportedly said, "I wasn't allowed to." This phrasing appears again and again in Mantid encounters. Awareness feels gated. Mantids are often described as appearing during moments of crisis within the encounter. When a witness resists. When panic escalates beyond control. When the smaller Greys pause or hesitate. The Mantid intervenes, not with force, but with mental containment. Fear collapses into neutrality. Awareness narrows. The encounter proceeds. Some witnesses describe Mantids as expressing something like concern, but it is never personal. It is systemic. Distress is inefficient. Trauma interferes with recall, compliance, or long-term objectives. The Mantid corrects for this the way a technician corrects for overheating machinery. Theories about Mantids vary widely. Some researchers suggest they represent a separate species entirely, operating alongside Greys as part of a cooperative effort. Others argue they are the true intelligence behind the phenomenon, with Greys acting as biological tools or artificial constructs. In this framework, Mantids are the planners, while Greys are the labor. Psychological interpretations often frame Mantids as archetypal figures, embodiments of authority or surveillance drawn from the human subconscious. Insects, after all, are ancient symbols of alienness and hierarchy. But this explanation struggles with the uniformity of reported roles. Mantids do not behave like monsters. They behave like managers. In several cases involving so-called hybrid programs, mantids are described overseeing interactions between human abductees and beings identified as partially human. Witnesses report mantids correcting posture, adjusting responses, or issuing mental commands to hybrids who fail to perform as expected. These scenes are remembered as deeply unsettling, not because of violence, but because of bureaucracy. Life reduced to procedure. Mantids also complicate the moral framing of alien encounters. Greys can be dismissed as cold. Tall greys as authoritarian. Mantids are something else entirely. They do not threaten. They do not reassure. They optimize. This removes any comforting narrative of benevolence or malice. What remains is function. If the phenomenon were chaotic, mantids would not appear. Their presence implies long-term planning, division of labor, and institutional memory. It implies that encounters are not isolated events, but components of a process unfolding across decades. In the taxonomy of alien types, mantids represent the point at which the phenomenon stops feeling exploratory and starts feeling organized. They suggest that someone, somewhere, is keeping track. And whatever is being tracked, it is not curiosity. Chapter 6: The Reptilians. Reptilians occupy a different category of fear than any other reported non-human entity. They are not framed as visitors or technicians. They are described as embedded. Their threat is not removal, but replacement. Not observation, but dominance. Descriptions vary in surface detail but align in structure. Reptilians are humanoid in posture, typically 6 to 8 feet tall, with muscular builds that contrast sharply with the frailty of greys. Skin is described as scaled or textured, often green, brown, grey, or black. Faces feature elongated jaws, pronounced brow ridges, slit-like pupils, and teeth that appear sharp even when the mouth is closed. Some witnesses note a sharp or sulfuric odor accompanying their presence. A defining feature of reptilian encounters is shapeshifting. Witnesses claim these beings can appear human, sometimes convincingly, sometimes imperfectly. The disguise fails under stress. Eyes elongate vertically. Skin ripples. Facial structure distorts for a fraction of a second before correcting. The terror comes not from seeing something alien, but from realizing it was already there. Reptilians are rarely associated with bedroom abductions. They appear instead in environments tied to authority and secrecy. Military installations, underground facilities, government and industrial spaces. The settings recur so frequently that they become part of the profile. Reptilians are encountered where power concentrates. In alleged underground base encounters, reptilians are described as commanding figures. Humans and greys operate under their supervision. Orders are issued. Boundaries enforced. Displays of strength serve as intimidation rather than violence. The message is clear. Resistance is anticipated and irrelevant. Theories about reptilian origins often cite the Alpha Draconis star system, framing them as an ancient, hierarchical species with territorial interests in Earth. In these narratives, reptilians are not explorers. They are colonizers. Humanity is not being studied. It is being managed. Other accounts suggest reptilians are indigenous to Earth, originating underground or surviving remnants of a pre-human civilization. These theories intersect with ancient serpent myths and chthonic gods. Whether literal or symbolic, the implication remains the same. Reptilians predate humanity and resent its dominance. Emotion plays a critical role in reptilian encounters. Unlike greys, who suppress fear, reptilians intensify it. Witnesses report heightened dread, anger, and hostility. Some describe feeling provoked, as if the reaction itself were the goal. This has led to persistent theories that reptilians benefit from emotional output, particularly fear and conflict. The most controversial claims involve infiltration. Witnesses allege reptilians occupy positions of influence through shapeshifting or hybridization. Political leaders, corporate power structures, military hierarchies. These narratives blur into conspiracy and are often dismissed, but their persistence reflects deep distrust of opaque systems. In abduction research, reptilians sometimes appear as enforcers alongside greys and mantids. When protocols are violated or resistance escalates, reptilians intervene. Their presence marks the end of negotiation. Skeptical explanations frame reptilians as archetypal projections, blending ancient serpent symbolism with modern political paranoia. This critique explains resonance, but not structure. Reptilians occupy a specific role within the broader alien taxonomy. They dominate. Where greys examine and mantids manage, reptilians rule. They represent the collapse of the comforting idea that the phenomenon is neutral or scientific. They embody the fear that the threat is not distant, but integrated into the systems that govern human life. They are not arriving. They are already here. Chapter 7: Hybrid Beings. Hybrid beings sit at the most uncomfortable intersection of alien taxonomy because they collapse the distance between observer and subject. They are not fully alien. They are not fully human. They exist as evidence of a process rather than a presence. If other entities watch, manage, or rule, hybrids represent outcome. Hybrids are most commonly described as humanoid figures with mixed features. Height varies widely. Some are child-sized. Others are adult-sized and nearly indistinguishable from humans at a distance. Skin tone is usually pale or slightly gray. Eyes are often larger than human norm, sometimes darker, sometimes oddly reflective. Facial features appear softened or smoothed, as if averaged rather than evolved. Witnesses frequently describe something off that cannot be located precisely. Hybrid encounters are most often reported within long-term abduction narratives. They rarely appear in isolated sightings. Instead, they are introduced gradually. Witnesses describe being shown beings at different developmental stages. Infant-like forms. Adolescents. Adults who appear capable of speech and independent movement. The progression implies intent and continuity. In many cases documented during the 1980s and 1990s, abductees reported being instructed to interact with hybrids. They were asked to hold them, comfort them, teach them basic behaviors, or simply stand nearby while observation occurred. These interactions are remembered as deeply distressing. The emotional response is not fear, but violation. Intimacy without consent. Theories surrounding hybrid origin focus on genetic programs combining human and non-human material. In these narratives, greys perform biological extraction. Tall greys supervise. Mantids oversee process integrity. Reptilians, when present, enforce outcomes. Hybrids are not experiments in curiosity. They are products. Some witnesses report being told hybrids are necessary for survival, adaptation, or coexistence. Others report no explanation at all. The lack of justification is consistent. Purpose is implied, not shared. Hybrids exist because the program exists. A recurring element in hybrid encounters is instruction. Witnesses describe being told that hybrids must learn to function among humans. Emotional expression. Social cues. Physical norms. In these accounts, hybrids are framed as future intermediaries or replacements. Whether literal or symbolic, the implication is destabilizing. Humanity is not being contacted. It is being integrated. Hybrid beings also appear in reports involving so-called walk-in experiences. Individuals describe encountering humans who feel unfamiliar, as if something has replaced or merged with the original personality. These claims are controversial and often dismissed as psychological phenomena. But within hybrid narratives, they serve a function. They suggest infiltration without spectacle. Skeptical interpretations frame hybrids as manifestations of reproductive anxiety, trauma, or identity fragmentation. These explanations carry weight, but they do not fully address the structural consistency of hybrid reports across unrelated witnesses. Hybrids are not chaotic. They follow stages. They have roles. What makes hybrids especially disturbing is their proximity to us. Greys are alien. Mantids are alien. Reptilians are adversarial. Hybrids blur the boundary that keeps categories intact. They suggest that separation is temporary. In the taxonomy of alien types, hybrids represent the endpoint of interaction. Observation becomes intervention. Intervention becomes transformation. The question is no longer what they want from us. The question becomes what remains of us once they are finished. Hybrids do not need to invade. They inherit. Chapter 8: Ultraterrestrials. Ultraterrestrials are not defined by where they come from, but by where they do not. They are not visitors arriving from distant stars. They are described as entities that have always been here, occupying a layer of reality that overlaps with ours without fully intersecting it. This distinction changes everything. If ultraterrestrials exist, then the phenomenon is not an invasion. It is a coexistence we only intermittently notice. The concept of ultraterrestrials gained traction as researchers struggled to reconcile wildly inconsistent origin claims. Some entities claimed extraterrestrial worlds. Others refused to specify origins at all. Still others appeared in contexts that defied space travel entirely, manifesting in locked rooms, underground locations, or spaces too small to contain physical beings. Ultraterrestrial theory emerged as a way to explain presence without arrival. Descriptions of ultraterrestrial encounters vary more than other alien types, but patterns remain. Witnesses report beings that appear humanoid, shadow-like, or indistinct, often shifting form or refusing clear visual focus. Physical boundaries behave strangely around them. Walls feel permeable. Distance collapses. Sound behaves incorrectly. The encounter feels less like meeting a creature and more like crossing into a different rule set. Unlike greys or mantids, ultraterrestrials are rarely associated with medical procedures. They do not examine bodies. They interact with perception. Witnesses describe altered states of awareness, missing time that feels expansive rather than blank, and communication that arrives as insight rather than language. The exchange feels symbolic, but the emotional impact is concrete. Ultraterrestrials often appear in historical and folkloric contexts long before the modern UFO era. Fairies, jinn, shadow figures, tricksters. The behaviors overlap. Abduction into strange environments. Time distortion. Moral ambiguity. The same patterns reappear under different names, suggesting continuity rather than coincidence. In some modern UFO encounters, ultraterrestrials appear alongside more familiar entities. Witnesses describe greys performing tasks while something else watches from the periphery, half seen, half felt. This has led to theories that ultraterrestrials are the true intelligence behind the phenomenon, with physical beings acting as interfaces or tools. Theories about ultraterrestrials range widely. Some propose they are higher dimensional beings intersecting with our reality at angles we cannot perceive. Others suggest they are remnants of a parallel terrestrial evolution that diverged long before human history. Still others frame them as consciousness-based entities that require belief, attention, or altered perception to interact at all. Skeptical explanations often categorize ultraterrestrials as misinterpretations of neurological or psychological states. Sleep paralysis, dissociation, temporal lobe activity. These explanations account for some features, but not for shared structure across unrelated cultures and eras. The stories align too well to dismiss as purely internal. What makes ultraterrestrials particularly destabilizing is their refusal to fit within scientific comfort zones. They do not require spacecraft. They do not require technology we can imagine. They do not obey distance. They undermine the assumption that reality is singular and continuous. In the taxonomy of alien types, ultraterrestrials represent a collapse of the visitor model. They suggest that the unknown is not elsewhere, but adjacent. Not arriving, but revealing itself when conditions allow. If greys imply intrusion and hybrids imply transformation, ultraterrestrials imply something far more unsettling. That humanity has never been alone. Only unaware. Chapter 9: Interdimensionals. Interdimensionals are defined less by appearance than by behavior. They are not constrained by distance, trajectory, or conventional physics. They do not arrive. They emerge. In witness accounts, their presence feels like a tear rather than a landing, a misalignment in reality rather than an intrusion into it. Reports of interdimensional beings often begin with environmental failure. Rooms distort. Angles feel wrong. Time loses continuity. Objects appear where they should not fit. Witnesses struggle to describe what they see because the experience resists stable perception. Shapes shift. Edges refuse to settle. The entities appear partially formed, as if intersecting our reality at an imperfect angle. Physical descriptions vary widely. Some interdimensionals are described as humanoid silhouettes filled with darkness or light. Others appear geometric, elongated, or fragmented, as if composed of overlapping forms. Eyes, when present, are often described as points of focus rather than organs. The body feels secondary to presence. Unlike greys or mantids, interdimensionals rarely perform actions we would recognize as tasks. They do not conduct examinations or issue commands. Their interaction is experimental. Witnesses report sudden downloads of information, overwhelming emotional surges, or the sense of being observed from outside linear time. Communication is rarely linguistic. It arrives as understanding without explanation. Famed encounters involving interdimensionals often blur into UFO sightings, poltergeist activity, and altered states of consciousness. Witnesses describe entities appearing during intense UAP events, near portals of light, or alongside craft that behave impossibly. In these cases, the craft itself may feel incidental, a symptom rather than a vehicle. Some researchers point to cases involving sudden appearances inside sealed spaces as evidence of interdimensional origin. Entities manifest in bedrooms without doors opening. Beings appear in vehicles at speed. Encounters begin and end without transition. These moments defy physical entry and exit models. Theories surrounding interdimensionals attempt to reconcile these violations. One proposes higher dimensional beings intersecting our three-dimensional reality the way a three-dimensional object intersects a two-dimensional plane. Another suggests parallel universes brushing against one another under specific conditions. In both models, the entities are not traveling. They are overlapping. Interdimensionals are also frequently associated with consciousness. Witnesses report that attention itself seems to enable interaction. Fear, focus, altered states, and expectation all appear to play roles. This has led to theories that interdimensionals are not bound to matter, but to awareness. They exist where perception allows them to. Skeptical explanations frame interdimensional encounters as neurological events. Sleep paralysis, temporal lobe anomalies, psychedelic states. These explanations account for sensory distortion, but not for the recurrence of specific structural elements across unrelated reports. The same patterns repeat. The same language appears. The same failure of reality is described. In the taxonomy of alien types, interdimensionals represent the breakdown of category itself. They do not fit into biological hierarchies or command structures. They undermine the assumption that entities must be organisms at all. If ultraterrestrials suggest cohabitation and hybrids suggest transformation, interdimensionals suggest something more destabilizing. That reality is not a closed system, and that what enters it may not be bound by the rules that keep us safe. Chapter 10: When the categories fail. By the time you reach the end of this taxonomy, the structure that once felt reassuring begins to strain. The categories blur. The boundaries leak. What started as a way to organize encounters becomes a map of uncertainty, with arrows pointing in too many directions at once. Greys suggest intrusion. Tall greys imply hierarchy. Nordics promise guidance. Mantids reveal management. Reptilians introduce dominance. Hybrids demonstrate outcome. Ultraterrestrials erase arrival. Interdimensionals collapse reality itself. Each category answers one question while creating several more. Together, they do not form a clean system. They form a pressure field. What becomes clear is that taxonomy is not truth. It is strategy. Witnesses classify because classification makes survival possible. Investigators classify because pattern is easier than chaos. Skeptics classify because dismissal requires containment. Everyone involved needs the same thing: a way to put the unknown somewhere it can be pointed at. But the phenomenon does not respect the boxes built around it. Encounters overlap. Roles change. Entities appear together in combinations that should not coexist if these were discrete species with fixed origins. A grey performs a procedure while a mantid observes. A reptilian enforces while a Nordic reassures. An interdimensional presence bleeds through the edges of an experience that began as a craft sighting. The categories hold only until they are tested. This is where origin stories begin to fray. Zeta Reticuli. The Pleiades. Alpha Draconis. Parallel dimensions. Subterranean realms. These explanations are offered, but rarely verified, and often contradicted by later encounters. They function less as coordinates and more as placeholders. Answers given to satisfy questions that refuse to go away. One possibility is that these entities are exactly what they appear to be: multiple non-human intelligences, each with distinct biology, culture, and agenda, converging on the same planet for reasons we do not understand. Another possibility is more unsettling: that these forms are interfaces. Masks adopted by a phenomenon that adapts to expectation while preserving control. In that framework, greys are not a species. They are a role. Mantids are not insects. They are management. Reptilians are not reptiles. They are dominance made visible. The form is not the point. The function is. This would explain why the taxonomy persists even as explanations collapse. The shapes remain because they work. They are recognizable enough to be remembered and alien enough to be feared. They anchor experience without clarifying it. They give witnesses something to describe when language fails. It would also explain why attempts to simplify the phenomenon never succeed. Calling it all psychological ignores shared structure. Calling it all extraterrestrial ignores behavior that defies travel. Calling it all interdimensional ignores the physicality of scars, implants, and missing time. Every explanation solves one problem and creates another. What remains consistent is intrusion. Not invasion in the cinematic sense, but access. Bedrooms. Bodies. Memory. Perception. Authority. The phenomenon goes where it should not be able to go and does what it should not be able to do. It does not announce itself. It does not seek permission. It does not explain itself in terms that hold. Taxonomy gives us the illusion of progress. We feel closer to understanding because we can list what we have seen. But lists can also be a distraction. They can keep us focused on surface differences while the underlying mechanism continues unchanged. If there is a unifying thread across all known alien types, it is not origin, appearance, or intent. It is asymmetry. Every encounter places humanity at a disadvantage. Knowledge is partial. Control is external. Consent is compromised. Whether the entity looks like a child-sized grey or a towering reptilian, the imbalance remains. This is not a catalogue meant to reassure. It is a warning about the limits of classification. At some point, the question stops being what these beings are. The question becomes why the experience continues to reproduce itself regardless of what we call it. This is strange. Next time we're looking at the kinds of known aliens. From Nordics to reptilians to greys, we'll learn about them all. This is Strange, written by ChatGPT, read by Speechelo, with music by Murica.
Strange.